Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video part 2 of the one sword versus two sword style. In this video, I will be discussing the two sword style and its pros and cons. And if I have time at the end, I might do the conclusion in this video, or I might make the conclusion part 3. So, without further ado, grab your beverages, your snacks, your comfy chairs, and let's get started. So, some of the pros of the two sword style. Gotta show the two swords, like I did in the last one. Ability to fight multiple opponents at once. This is the first pro of this style because in the last video I said that with one sword style it is more difficult to fight multiple opponents, but with two sword style it becomes slightly easier. Because with two sword style, as I'm about to demonstrate, if I have an opponent to the right of me and an opponent to the left of me, if my opponent to the right attacks from up above, I can block upwards. And if my opponent to the left attacks from below, I can block downwards. And I could parry their blades away, and at this point I could even focus my attention towards one of the two opponents. Let's say I focus my attention to the one on the left. He attacks me with his blade, I block with my first sword, and then I thrust with my second sword, either injuring him to the point he can't continue or straight out killing him. It's the same with the opponent to my right. I block with one sword and then I slash with the other, or stab, what have you. So fighting multiple opponents at once, and this could even account for 2, 4, 6, maybe even 8 or 10 opponents all at the same time. So fighting multiple opponents all at once is very useful. That is one of the benefits of the two sword style. Being able to attack and defend at the same time. I might just stand up for the majority of this video, as no, I don't actually have to. As I said before, with one sword style, you are limited to attacking or defending. That is the whole thing with the one sword style. You are limited to attack or defense. With two sword style, you are able to choose which sword arm you attack and defend with. So I could, again, block with my right, stab with my left. Block with my left, stab with my right. Or if my opponent is also dual wielded, block with both my arms and just kick him in the gut. And just Spartan kick him in the gut, I should say. This is Sparta, bitches! But, joking aside, attack and defense at the same time. Having a backup weapon is a benefit of the two sword style. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're in a duel against a very strong opponent, and for shits and giggles, he's using a Chinese sword breaker, and he attacks you. The sword breaker hits your sword just so, and the sword breaks. Hence the name sword breaker. Although I don't actually think the Chinese sword breaker was predominantly used to break swords. It's just one of its uses. I could be wrong, again. quote me in the comments below. But having a backup weapon, so one of your swords break, and generally with a one sword style, you're done. I mean, you might also have a few throwing knives, maybe a couple of shuriken, kunai, something like that, or a dagger, or in the case of samurai, a short sword. But if your main weapon breaks, which would be your long sword, in that kind of situation, you're screwed, because your opponent will still have a stronger weapon than you, and the only weapon you had that could combat it is shattered. However, with the two-sword style, that is not a major problem, for the simple fact that you have a second longsword, a second sword to fight with. You won't have to resort to using your daggers or such and so of that nature. Now, with that in mind, that is number 3 of the pros and cons, having a backup weapon. The number 4, the fourth pro of the two-sword style is unpredictability. And with that in mind, the unpredictability stems from the fact that with two swords, you're not as likely to use a technique that your opponent will recognize. Especially since you really can't use Wrath Guard with two swords. You can, and you'd probably look badass doing it, but with Wrath Guard, you really can't perform the same kind of techniques that you would with a one-sword style. Now, if you can do that, if you are capable of doing techniques with two swords that normally people would only aspire to being able to do with one sword, which I'm not gloating or anything, but I have actually, in my personal sword style, the Howling Wolf style, I actually do that. My sword style is predominantly two-sword style, and I have actually integrated one-sword techniques and found a way to make them work with two swords. But with that in mind, the unpredictability of the two-sword style gives you an advantage because you're not set to a specific form. Now, if you studied Nitenichi Ryu, which is the sword style Miyamoto Musashi created, using the long sword and the short sword, or the katana and the wakazaki, then you're more restricted. And when I speak about two-sword style, I mean two swords of the same length and weight. Many people, when they talk about dual wielding, is you have a long sword and a short sword. I personally do not like that. I do not like that style of fighting, specifically because with the shorter blade, I just feel like that is too much of a handicap for your opponent to take advantage of, because your opponent can easily attack with a long blade, which is what the long blade is for, and use the short blade to block. But I personally rather have two full-length swords, just because it's easier for me to fight that way. If you're comfortable with the daisho fighting, where you have the long sword and the short sword, perfectly fine. You do that. You do you. I do me. So that is number 4. Have unpredictability, where you are not set to a specific I want to say routine of techniques, and I'll just roll with that. Number 5 is increased strength. This is a pro because when you're swinging around two swords, you're gonna get a workout. You swing around a one sword, you swing around a single two-handed sword, and you're gonna get a workout. But with this sword style, both your arms are supporting the weight of one whole sword. So you're gonna feel that whole weight on your arms, and it's gonna give you a workout. So increased strength. And I'm realizing number 6 also goes into number 4 here, but number 6 is less set forms. And what I mean by that is it goes into the same thing as unpredictability, whereas you can fight your opponent with techniques and moves that they've never seen before, and they won't know how to counter you. Now, if you're fighting an extremely skilled warrior who has seen a lot of weird techniques that don't sound like they work when you explain them, or sound like they only work on paper, and you use them against him and they actually are effective, an extremely skilled warrior will learn how to compensate rather quickly for the difference in his skill. But if you're fighting somebody who has been taught a very rigid sword style that has set forms, set techniques, this is what you do when your opponent throws a false cut and goes into a thrust or a feint or something like that. Like, this is how you block it. If your opponent thrusts, you block with the side of your blade, close the distance, and go for the throat. Or if your opponent slashes, you parry with the edge, rotate your blade, and go for the collarbone or something like that. With two-sword style, you're not so limited in your forms. You're not forcibly set in one form, and my uncle is being an annoyance as usual when I'm trying to film. You're not held down to any specific set. I do hope I'm not rambling too much, and it's probably a good idea I decided to make these separate parts instead of one big hour-long video. Now the cons of the two-sword style, and there are quite a bit of them. But in my personal opinion, the cons, they do justify the two-sword style's use to some extent. Harder to use is the first con, and what I mean by that is, to use a two-sword style, you have to be somewhat ambidextrous, which means you have to be able to use both your right and left hand at the same time. If you're not so good with using both your right and your left hands, then you're not going to be as effective a fighter with this two-sword style.
You better hurry up and don't keep doing it.
I am hurrying as fast as I can with being accurate. Second con of the two-sword style is it's harder to learn. As I said before, one sword style is relatively easy to learn. You pick up a sword, you give somebody a sword, you show them a few simple cuts and techniques, and they can basically pick up the gist of how to use those techniques within the first hour of picking up the sword generally. With two-sword style, it's much harder because you're manipulating blades in both your left and your right hand. So two-sword style is harder to learn. But once you've mastered it, it is extremely proficient. You can be extremely proficient once mastery has been achieved, or should I say, at least when you're good at it, because there's no such thing as ever truly mastering a martial form. Number 3 is more direct weight. And what I mean by this is the weight of the sword itself, your two swords, you're going to feel the entirety of their weight on you. when you wield two swords. It's not like one sword style where the weight distribution again is cut in half between your two hands. With two sword style, you feel the entirety of both swords' weight, which will actually cause muscle fatigue to set in more quickly. This is where increased strength is a pro, because as you fatigue your muscles, you're actually strengthening them as you work them. So more direct weight that you're going to feel. It's not as cut in half. Number 4, the fourth con of the two sword style is your attacks are cut in half. And what I mean by that is any attack you make with a two sword style will only be half as powerful as if you attacked with only one sword. And this is again because of the fact that the power you get from the one sword style comes from both your arms. With only using one arm each to perform the attacks, naturally the power is cut in half. So that is the fourth con of the style. Number 5 is less control of your blades. As I mentioned before, with one sword style you have more control over where your blade's going to go, how it's going to cut, and how good it's going to cut. With two sword style, you have only one arm controlling your sword. So it actually makes it more difficult to land a precise cut on whatever it is you're cutting, be it tatami, be it water bottles, be it rolled up newspaper, or if you're on forged in fire, pig carcasses. That is number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the fifth con of the sword style, is that you have less control over your swords. The final con that I have on my paper, again, comment down below if you have other cons or pros to either style, is more physically demanding. These styles, the two sword style is at least twice as physically demanding as the one sword style, because again you're using two swords, one sword in each hand, and you're going to fatigue far more quickly than if you were to just use one sword. You're going to burn about twice as much energy using two swords as you would with one. Now, as I said before, I guess I'll make the full conclusion in the third part, but I just want to say that if you are trained, and if you are trained well enough and you go through the correct physical conditioning, you can wield two swords with little to no real effort or problem. At least that is the way I see it. But I personally have been developing the two sword, my Howling Wolf style, for the last 10 years. So I'm fairly confident in my abilities to wield two swords at once. But as I said before, I will do the full conclusion in the third part of this video. So until next time, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all, be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons. I'm out. Peace. And if this comes up afterwards, happy belated 4th of July. See ya.